Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought that I would talk about this little interesting topic, or this topic that I thought was very particularly interesting. And I think that this is going to be a decent logical conversation, at least when it comes to this video. But of course, every single one of my videos, at least that I try to put out, I'm going to try to be as logical and objective as possible. And in this conversation, in the world of boxing, and I am probably going to have to release my most recent adjustments to my top 10 pound for pound list heading into this year because there's just been so much that have changed. There's now new, completely undisputed champions in the world of boxing. There also is, in my view, certain people that deserve to be within the top 10 pound for pound list that were not there last year. Certain fighters, maybe like that of a Devin Haney, a Shakur Stevenson, maybe even a Jermell Charlo, a Dimitri Bivol, any one of those fighters. And that also means that there's going to have to be at least two, maybe even three fighters that are going to have to be exited off my list that were on my list earlier on this year, excuse me. So the question is, where is my pound for pound list at? Where overall do I rank certain fighters? Who is within my top five? And overall, who do I think are new entries or deserve to be new entries on my list? But this main conversation I thought was very particularly interesting. And I've talked about Mr. Jermell Charlo actually quite a bit on this channel. Not as much as maybe some other fighters like that of a Canelo or a Terrence Crawford or Errol Spence Jr., but I still have talked about him here and there. And I've always said that, especially before the Brian Castano win, that I never personally had Jermell Charlo on my pound for pound list. And I know a lot of people would certainly disagree with that. And Dante's Boxing Nation, what he's going to argue like usual, is that this is a racial issue. And don't get me wrong, do I believe that ESPN, with certain black fighters have a racial issue? No doubt about it. But at the end of the day, Dante's Boxing Nation, and I'm not going to try to make this a super duper lengthy video. I'm going to try to keep it maybe around 20 to 25 minutes long, maybe a little bit longer than that. We'll see what happens, but I don't want to stretch it out too long. But Dante's Boxing Nation is going to argue that Jermell Charlo, that not only should he be on this list, that he should probably be within the top five. And I just don't know if I can personally agree with that sentiment, but we're going to be talking about that. But we're not also just going to be talking about Jermell Charlo. We're also going to be talking about Devin Haney, Vasily Lomachenko, Alexander Usyk, Tyson Fury, Canelo Alvarez, and where those guys, in my view, deserve to be on the pound for pound list and why. Naoya Inoue. We're going to be talking about quite a bit of fighters in this video. But anyways, let's get into the video. Let's see what Mr. Dante's Boxing Nation has to say.
Winner jumps on that pound for pound list.
Dante's Boxing Nation, what's going on, guys? Okay, so if you Google ESPN right now and you go to Wikipedia, their summary of ESPN reads, while ESPN is one of the most successful sport networks, there has been criticism of ESPN. This includes accusations of biased coverage, conflict of interest, and controversies with individual broadcasters and analysts. Guys, once again, what I just read is not from a boxing article. That is from Wikipedia. And they just basically describe ESPN as the Fox News of sports in America. Now, you don't have to take Wikipedia.
Yes, and I don't completely disagree with what Dante's Boxing Nation is saying, that ESPN certainly can be biased in their commentary. But Dante's Boxing Nation, pretty much what that is to me is the pot calling the kettle black. It is what it is. I've been watching Dante's Boxing Nation for years, or at least I've known of his channel for years. And eventually why I stopped watching certain channels like that of a Dante's Boxing Nation or Boxing Ego is because eventually, all in all, you realize that they have a very big racial issue. And I am not a person, all in all, that overall is attracted to energy like that. I am a person, all in all, or not even just someone who's, super duper pro-racial and obviously has a racial issue, but someone, all in all, who has an emotional issue. And I'm a very decently logical and objective person. So the channels that I would personally recommend that I've seen out there for sports channels, Chronicles of Judo 144, I thought was a very decent channel when he was around. Unfortunately, he does not do YouTube anymore. I believe he only does Patreon. But I thought that he was one of the more logical and objective channels out there. The Hatman Strikes Back, I thought was a very decent channel. He's still around, I believe. Boxing Wave, the IBFP, of course, a lot of people like him as well. Those are the certain channels that I usually would recommend. Dante's Boxing Nation or anyone a part of the LDBC or new media, also ESPN and Fox Sports News. I don't really trust them really as far as I can see them. That's not me stating that I believe, or that I disagree with everything that they say. But at the end of the day, there is a certain narrative that they usually overall try to go about. It just is what it is. And we don't have to necessarily agree on anything, or excuse me, on everything. But at the end of the day, when you can clearly tell that someone has a very big issue and that there are certain double standards that constantly go on at hand, and someone is not consistent with their energy or they're not consistent with their debates, it makes no logical sense. That's when the problem comes in. And that's usually when I tune in. But anyways, we're going to continue on with this. We're going to see where Dante's point goes from here.
His word for it. Just look at ESPN's pound for pound list. Keep in mind, guys, this is their most recent list. After Jermell Charlo, way after Jermell Charlo, made history, becoming the undisputed champion and arguably the deepest division in the sport of boxing. And where does ESPN have Jermell?
I really don't know if you take a look at things logically and objectively. I really have no idea how Dante really calls the 154-pound division one of the deepest divisions in boxing. I really can't tell if Dante, if he's just trying to convince people overall of that fact or if he truly believes it. But if you're a person with any intelligence or any overall logic and objectivity, there's no way that the 154-pound division is one of the deepest divisions in boxing. How can it be? I mean, really, who has Jermell Charlo really beat there besides Brian Castano? That has been a grade. Now, if you want to now debate that Jermell Charlo has finally joined the party at the top 10 pound for pound list, I wouldn't necessarily have a problem with that because I think that the Brian Castano win is at least an A- win, at least on the A- level. Some would even debate that it's A grade, and I wouldn't have a problem with that. But who else there really would you debate as A grade? Is Erickson Lubin really an A grade fighter? Well, let's test that theory out. Do you think that Sebastian Fundora, do you think that Sebastian Fundora is really an A-grade fighter? I don't know if I would call him an A-grade fighter. I don't think that he's proven enough. And I certainly don't think that Erickson Lubin ever was an A-grade fighter. Do we think that Jason Rosario was ever an A-grade fighter? I don't think so, because I don't think that he would ever beat any quality championship fighter. Do we think that Tony Harrison, who is a fighter that Jermell Charlo lost to when he was at the prime of his career, the best point in his career, may I also say, when he was becoming a unified champion of that division. This was not like the same situation when Lomachenko lost to Salido when he was a bit inexperienced in professional boxing and he ended up losing, to a decently tough fighter. And Tony Harrison's a decently tough fighter, but he's just not a great fighter. And Jermell Charlo ended up losing the first fight to him. So listen, what I'll state is this. Jermell Charlo, in my view, you can certainly debate that he could be on the top 10 pound for pound list. But if you also debated at the current moment in time, that because, in my view, overall how lackluster that 154-pound division is at the current moment in time, and I know Dante would not agree with that, but it just is what it is. I really overall don't know how you can really debate that the 154-pound division in the sport of boxing, how it really is one of the most talented divisions in all of boxing. It really isn't. It's really one of the weakest divisions in all of boxing, if not the weakest that overall I can personally think of right now, at least for any of the divisions that usually matter. It just is what it is. When I think of some of the most competitive divisions, I'm thinking about 147. I'm thinking maybe overall about, 175. I'm thinking maybe about 135, somewhere around there. Those are the main divisions that I would personally think are the most competitive at the current moment in time. The heavyweight division, even to a degree, maybe you can say that as well. And if there's a couple of other divisions to where, maybe I'm missing them, go ahead and let me know. But those are usually the main ones that I would think are extremely competitive. The other ones, in my view, not necessarily much, or at least some of them. And 154, I'm sorry, but besides Jermell Charlo and Brian Castano, there really is no other A-grade fighters there. None whatsoever.
Charlo on their list? Nowhere. He's not even on the list. Now, let me just say this. If ESPN had Jermell Charlo on the bottom of their list, that would be bias. But to not even have him on the list, this is absolute blatant racism at its finest.
Listen, what I'll state is this. Has ESPN in the past, in my view, shown that they are somewhat racially motivated, maybe towards Caucasoids or Latino fighters? Sure, you can argue that, or maybe against black fighters, you can argue that here and there. But at the end of the day, to say that Jermell Charlo, him not being on a top 10 pound for pound list, that's just racism, and there's no way that you can't have him on the top 10 pound for pound list. let's not forget that Jermell Charlo is probably in one of the weakest divisions in all of boxing right now. And once again, not everyone is going to agree with that. It just is what it is. And on top of that, the one loss that he has in his career, which was not that long ago, was only a couple of years ago, was to a fighter that never even won a belt in his career and had multiple knockout losses. Okay, multiple knockout losses to every championship fighter that he had ever fought. Okay, so let that be known. No, 154 pounds is not one of the deepest divisions in all of boxing, because all of the opponents there, or all of the boxers there, have shown themselves to be very wildly inconsistent. Julian J. Rock Williams is not an A-grade fighter. Jason Rosario is not an A-grade fighter. Jarrett Hurd has proven himself to not be an A-grade fighter. Erickson Lubin certainly is not an A-grade fighter. And even some of these fighters that are within the division, if you were to count them as decent fighters, they have not even fought Jermell Charlo. Jermell Charlo has never even fought a Julian J. Rock Williams. And at this point, it wouldn't really matter anyway, because the only point in time Julian J. Rock Williams has ever really even debatably been an A-grade fighter was when he was undefeated and fought Jermell Charlo, the bigger brother in terms of weight. So I'm sorry, but Jermell Charlo, even though you can certainly very much debate him on the pound-for-pound list, I really don't understand the narratives of Jermell Charlo debatably being a top 5 pound-for-pound fighter. How can you really say that? Who has Jermell Charlo really beaten other than Brian Castano to really qualify himself as a top 5 pound-for-pound fighter? Because when we talk about the top 5 pound-for-pound, I think that those guys are pretty much locked into the top 5 pound-for-pound. And if you have heard my recent top 5 pound-for-pound fighters, I have Tyson Fury there, I have Canelo Alvarez there, I have Errol Spence there, I have Terrence Crawford there, and I also have Alexander Usyk there. Those are the fighters that debatably have some top 10 pound-for-pound wins in their career, or they have a decent resume. They've looked extraordinarily dominant, like that of a Terrence Crawford. Jermell Charlo is not above any of those fighters, in my view, on the current pound-for-pound list. He just isn't. I'm sorry, but he's not on their level. He is not on the top 5 pound-for-pound level. He never has been. Overall, I think that he's a very decent fighter, but if he is going to get within the top 5 pound-for-pound, he's going to have to beat someone like a Terrence Crawford or Errol Spence Jr., in my opinion, for himself to qualify. Either that, or he would have to go up to 160 and beat a Demetrius Bulbo Andrade or a Gennady Triple G Golovkin, someone of a sort. And to be quite honest with you, I don't think that he would beat either of them. I think that Jermell Charlo, in my view, as a unified champion, I think himself as a champion, I think that his days are numbered. Now, if that division stays the way that it is, with Sebastian Fundora and, Julian J. Rock Williams, who is pretty much completely wore down, and Erickson Lubin, who really is not that good of a fighter anyway, and with all those other fighters, yeah, he can stay a champion there for a while, but eventually Terrence Crawford and Errol Spence, they may move up, or Jermell Charlo may be forced to move up, and that's when we're really going to see how great Jermell Charlo truly is. And I don't think that Jermell Charlo, let me state this for example, I don't think Jermell Charlo would beat either Terrence Crawford or Errol Spence Jr. I don't think that he would beat either of them. To be quite honest with you, I think that Jermell Charlo would have been lucky to even beat a prime Keith Thurman. But it is what it is.
There is nothing else you can call it. There is no way you can justify not having Jermell Charlo on this list. And by the way, just a side note.
Well, actually, yeah, you could. And I just gave you several reasons. Jermell Charlo is a fighter to where even though he is very decently talented, and even though I probably would have him at the bottom of my top 10 pound-for-pound list, if we just take a look at the top 5, once again, my top 5, which I believe, of course, is decently logical and objective, Alexander Usyk. He is not above Alexander Usyk. Terrence Crawford, he can be above Terrence Crawford. Errol Spence Jr., he certainly can be above Errol Spence Jr. Tyson Fury, I certainly would not put him above Tyson Fury. Tyson Fury has won some great generational fights. And let me talk about Tyson Fury right now as well. Because whenever Tyson Fury is mentioned on the top 10 pound-for-pound list, people always take a look at him and they're like, oh, well, why is he on the top 10 pound-for-pound list? Well, that should be self-explanatory. Because Tyson Fury was able to beat Vladimir Klitschko when he was looked at as one of the top 5 pound-for-pound fighters in the world. He was also just recently able to completely embarrass and dominate Dillian White, who was one of the top-ranked heavyweights in the world. And he also was able to embarrass Deontay Wilder, who was probably at the time one of the top 20 pound-for-pound fighters in the world when he was at his most dominant. He was able to embarrass him in all 3 fights. I believe that he is the only heavyweight of this era to win every single belt of this generation, at least I believe. And on top of that, he's undefeated and a very highly skilled fighter for the heavyweight division. So if you're a person that knows shit about boxing in the first place, you're going to have Tyson Fury on your pound for pound list. It just is what it is. So if you have Tyson Fury, you have Alexander Usyk, you have Terrence Crawford, you have Errol Spence Jr. Canelo Alvarez did lose his last fight, but it ended up being against an A-grade fighter and a fighter that was decently bigger than him. When it comes to Jermell Charlo, the best win of his career, hands down, was against Brian Gastano, which I think is a very decent win. But do I really believe that Brian Gastano is an A-plus fighter? No, I do not. It just is what it is. And also, do I think that that loss against Tony Harrison a couple of years ago, do I think that that also affects his pound-for-pound ranking? Yes, I do. So, in my view, out of any of the fighters currently this year that I believe deserve a high ranking on the pound-for-pound list because of what they've done, I would personally rank, and these are the main fighters that have, in my view, finally made the pound-for-pound list after what they've done this year. I would have Dimitri Bivol on my pound-for-pound list now. I would have Shakur Stevenson on my pound-for-pound list now. And I also would have that at Devin Haney. In my view, Devin Haney, Shakur Stevenson, and Dimitri Bivol, they're all above Jermell Charlo. And I know not a lot of people would agree with that, but if we just take a look at things logically and objectively, Dimitri Bivol, first of all, you can argue has bigger wins in his career. Certainly that Canelo Alvarez win is bigger than any of the wins in Jermell Charlo's career. And on top of that, he's undefeated. So there is no debate. You really have to have Dimitri Bivol over Jermell Charlo. Shakur Stevenson, not only is he decently more skilled than Jermell Charlo in my view, he has no losses, and you can debate that the Oscar Valdez win was bigger than the Brian Castano win. Devin Haney, in my view, is also more skilled than that of Jermell Charlo. He's also undefeated, and on top of that, he was able to defeat the undefeated George Kambosos. Now, in my opinion, like I stated, George Kambosos, he's not really the creme de la creme, but at least what you can say is that he was coming off of a very great win over the undefeated Teofimo Lopez, who, of course, was coming off a great win over the great Vasily Lomachenko. So at the end of the day, even though Jermell Charlo, I think that Jermell Charlo is a decently great fighter, I don't know if I would really have him that high on my pound-for-pound list. And to be honest with you, it's probably even a debate in the first place whether he is on there. And I know a certain amount of people that are going to highly disagree with that. Just because you're undisputed, in my view, does not mean that you did it against that of the greatest competition. It just is what it is.
We're dropping the new media pound for pound list. It's coming really, really soon. But going back to this ESPN list, and the reason why we have to address this is because we're talking about the biggest sport network in America. And if you look at their list from top to bottom, it is completely inconsistent. They have Devin Haney at...
Well, you can say somewhat that it's inconsistent, Dante, but your lists really aren't that much better. And I do agree that whenever it comes to a logical and objective debate, you do have to have consistency. But once again, that's Dante with the pot calling the kettle black, because he's pretty much the least consistent, one of the least consistent commentators that I've ever seen. I mean, I've literally seen him say different things and change narratives within literally a span of just one day. So, like I said, Dante's Boxing Nation is not super duper reliable either. And I'm not saying that ESPN is. I don't think that they're super duper reliable either. But at the end of the day, once again, just this narrative of Jermell Charlo really has to be within the top 5 pound for pound. I don't even know if Jermell Charlo is one of the top 5 pound for pound American black fighters in all of boxing right now, let alone one of the top 5 pound for pound boxers in general. So at the end of the day, no, Jermell Charlo is not a top 5 pound for pound boxer in the world of boxing. Now, would he be a top 10? You certainly can now debate that now that he's completely unified and he finally got that A-grade win in his career. But he does have a loss to Tony Harrison, who pretty much has been a letdown within his career. And also, when it comes down to it, Jermell Charlo, I would not say that he beat the best of competition other than that of Brian Castano, where you can debate that there's a decent amount of fighters on the top 10 pound for pound list that could be above him. Once again, I already listed my top 5 pound for pound fighters. Those guys, in my view, are clearly ahead of Jermell Charlo. I really don't even think it's a debate. But when you talk about even fighters just like Naoya Inoue, Josh Taylor, Shakur Stevenson, Devin Haney, Dimitri Bivol, all those fighters that I just mentioned right now could debatably be over that of a Jermell Charlo. And some people may say, well, how could you say that? Well, if we take a look at Naoya Inoue, even though I don't think he has as big of a win in his career as what a Brian Castano would be, Naoya Inoue has been the most dominant fighter probably on the planet within the past few years, if not even more. And what I will say is that at least he has a couple of decent wins. But one thing I will say about Naoya Inoue is this. He is going to have to start facing better competition if he wants to remain on my top 10 pound per pound list. I would have him on my top 10 pound per pound list, but he really has not moved up from the number 8 or number 9 position on my top 5 pound for pound list, because even though he's extraordinarily dominant, I can't have you on my top 5, if you're a person that really has no A-grade wins in his career. It just is what it is. But in a way, I probably would have slightly ahead of Jermell Charlo, at least debatably. And then when you talk about Josh Taylor, that's another one that you could possibly debate over Jermell Charlo. He also has been completely unified. He has no losses. And you can debate that the resume is even better for Josh Taylor, with the wins over Victor Postal, Jose Ramirez, and overall Regis Prograis, and a couple of other ones. You can debate that Josh Taylor's run was certainly tougher, a hell of a lot tougher than that of Jermell Charlo. And then, of course, that leads us to Dimitri Bivol, Devin Haney, and Shakur Stevenson. Dimitri Bivol has the win over Canelo Alvarez, so just forget it. And then when you talk about Devin Haney, not only do I believe that he's more skilled than Jermell Charlo, but you can debate that George Kambosos win is right on par with the Brian Castano win if you wanted to. And Shakur Stevenson completely outboxing that of what the hell was his name, Oscar Valdez. That's an A-grade win in my book as well, especially after the victory last year, what Oscar Valdez had over Miguel Berchelt. So all those fighters, in my view, that I just mentioned, you could easily debate over that of a Jermell Charlo. And I know not everyone is going to agree with that, but it is what it is.
Number 10, which is a whole nother story because Devin Haney is underneath Lomachenko. Somehow they have Lomachenko ranked higher than the guy he lost to recently, which is Teofimo Lopez. And then you have Devin Haney that just beat George Kambosos, the same George Kambosos that just beat Teofimo Lopez. But yet they have Lomachenko ranked above Devin Haney. But on top of that...
Well, I somewhat get what Dante's Boxing Nation is saying here, but what I will say is this. If you were to still have Lomachenko within your top 10, I would somewhat understand it because of the resume that Lomachenko has within the lower weight divisions. I think that the wins that he has over Nicholas Walters and Guillermo Rigondeaux and Jorge Linares when he was at his best, and also the win that he had over Gary Russell Jr., Lomachenko's resume and his skill set is not to be taken lightly. However, what I will say is this. Lomachenko is no longer on my top 10 pound for pound list. He just can't be. And it's not that I don't respect his skill set. I think that Vasily Lomachenko is a very excellently skilled fighter. But I can't have you on my top 10 pound for pound list when you lost the last A-grade fight of your career. And on top of that, you have no belts. But there's fighters out there, like that of a Devin Haney and Jermell Charlo. All those fighters, in my view, right now have to be above that of a Lomachenko. But I would probably have Lomachenko within my top 20 at least, maybe even within my top 15. But Lomachenko, overall, I understand why they put him on the top 10 pound per pound list. But unfortunately for Lomachenko, I'm going to have to see him do some things and actually win some belts back for him to come back on my top 10 pound per pound list. Same thing with Gervonta Tank Davis as well. Because Gervonta Tank Davis, I had him, I believe, at the number 9 spot earlier on this year when I released my first pound per pound list. But he's no longer there anymore because overall he's not really facing A-grade competition. And on top of that, I thought that he underwhelmed somewhat drastically within his last couple of performances. But anyway.
How do you have Devin Haney and Shakur Stevenson on the list, but you don't have Jermell Charlo on the list? Jermell Charlo has been on top in the sport of boxing longer than Shakur and Devin Haney has, so all three of them should be on the list. Someone else who's pound for pound one of the best fighters.
Well, Jermell Charlo has been on top for longer, but in a much weaker division. Devin Haney, you can actually debate within that division, and he does not have the greatest of resumes either as of yet, but you can debate that win at George Kambosos, and he has a certain amount of less fights, I believe, now than Jermell Charlo does. He's done more overall, or about the same as you can debate at this age, than what Jermell Charlo has done within his whole entire career. And Devin Haney is in his early 20s. So it is what it is. And that goes for Shakur Stevenson as well.
Today is Stephen Fulton. So ESPN, they don't have...
No, Stephen Fulton, and he's a good little fighter, but no, he is not one of the top 10 pound per pound fighters in the world. I like Stephen Fulton. I think that he's a decent fighter, but I believe that he's only a one-weight division champion, and on top of that, the biggest win of your career is over Brandon Figueroa, which in my opinion is a decent win, but it's not really an A-plus win. So at the end of the day, no, but Stephen Fulton is not a top 10, pound per pound fighter, and he's a decent fighter, but to be quite honest with you, I don't even know if he'd 100% be within my top 20 pound per pound. It just is what it is, and I like, Stephen Fulton is a decent little fighter. I think that he's very crafty, but I need to see bigger wins. Now, if he ends up beating Inoue or, someone around there that I believe, is within there, then yes, there has to be conversations about him being in the top 10 pound per pound. But no, not until that happens.
Any of the real pound for pound best fighters from America, at least.
And that's why you have to be very careful with Dante's Boxing Nation, because basically what Dante's objective is how many black American fighters can I put on my top 10 pound per pound list? Because once again, he's a very big pro-racial person, and he's very emotionally motivated. So you have to be very, very careful. So ESPN is not reliable that much in my view, and neither are any of these LDBC new media channels. But anyway.
On their list. But yet, they put Tyson Fury on their list, someone who's retired. They have Canelo on.
Well, Dante, as you stated, when it comes down to it, we know damn well that Tyson Fury more than likely is not full-on retired, and there's already been rumors that he is going to face the Anthony Joshua Alexander Usyk winner of the rematch. So Tyson Fury does have to be, in my view, within the top 5 pound per pound. He is within mine, because he clearly is the best heavyweight of the past 10 plus years.
Their list, someone who just came off of a loss, and they have Vasily Lomachenko on the list, who's inactive and just lost all.
Well, I agree with Vasily Lomachenko not being on the list, or he should not be on the list, but Canelo Alvarez I cannot agree with. But of course, Dante, we all know that he hates Canelo Alvarez's guts. So he's going to try to do whatever he can to degrade him. But once again, notice all the fighters that he had a problem with being ranked high in the pound per pound list. Notice overall who he had a problem with. He didn't even mention Naoya Inoue mainly. The fighters that he mentioned were Vasily Lomachenko, Alexander Usyk, and Tyson Fury. Those are the main ones that he mentioned. And Canelo. So once again, when I say that Dante's Boxing Nation has a racial issue, I get these guys on here that watch his channel or protect him, and they say, oh, well, no, he's just speaking the truth. No, a lot of the times Dante has a very big emotional and racial issue. It just is what it is.
His belts 2 fights ago, when Alexander Usyk became the undisputed champion in the weakest division in the sport, the cruiserweight division, ESPN, they had him.
No, it wasn't the weakest division in the sport. And the reason why it wasn't the weakest division in the sport is because there was a lot of undefeated fighters there. There was a lot of fighters that, even if they did have 1 or 2 losses, they were decently experienced. But there was a lot of undefeated fighters that Alexander Usyk had to go through, like Mars Bradis or Michael Hunter, who was a fighter, a black fighter that now is having decent success at that of the heavyweight division. But even if you're going to bitch about, at the time overall, that Alexander Usyk, that he shouldn't have been rated that high then, Alexander Usyk has to be top 5 pound per pound now, because he was outweighed by 20, 30 plus pounds within his last fight against Anthony Joshua, and he was able to completely embarrass him. A fighter in Anthony Joshua, to where before his loss to Alexander Usyk, I had him in within my top 10 pound per pound. So at the end of the day, Alexander Usyk, he has to be within your top 10 pound per pound. There's no debate about it. He has to be really within your top 5 if you're a logical and objective thinker. It just is what it is.
Ranked as number 6 pound for pound, the best fighter in the world. But they don't have Jermell Charlo on the list at all, despite the fact that
Well, is Jermell Charlo really in the same league as Alexander Usyk? Is he really in the same league as an Alexander Usyk? Does that point really make sense? Is there really almost anything that Jermell Charlo beats Alexander Usyk in? I mean, really, there's not one category that he beats him in. He doesn't beat him in skill set for his division. He doesn't beat him in dominance. He doesn't beat him in being undefeated, if you want to go by that point, which Dante usually does. He doesn't beat him in resume, not really even that close. He doesn't beat him in anything. So of course Alexander Usyk would be ranked above Jermell Charlo on the list. Once again, notice the only fighters that Dante has a problem with being on the list are fighters that have the same complexion of a Canelo and Alexander Usyk, of Vasily Lomachenko, those fighters. And he also has mentioned that he doesn't like Naoya Inoue being as high as what he is, but he don't even mention him that much because the main thing he's focusing on are the Caucasoid fighters. But it is what it is. And I get it to a degree once again. Can there be great white hypes? Can there be a certain push by certain media outlets of certain demographic of fighters or athletes? Absolutely no doubt about it. But listen, at the end of the day, you have to know the difference between overall, what is real discrimination or what overall is real racism. And just because Jermell Charlo is not on the top 10 pound per pound list, I can give you several different arguments overall to why he is not on there, or debatably, at least on mine. But anyway.
He's actually beat better competition at 154 than Usyk did when he was at cruiserweight. These are blatant double standards. These are the most...
Right, but even if you wanted to debate that, which to be honest with you, I don't really even think is that true. But when it comes down to it, Alexander Usyk now has a great 8-grade victory over Anthony Joshua. What victory does Jermell Charlo have in his career that is as big as that Anthony Joshua win? Nothing. He doesn't have any of those in his career.
Overt double standards I've seen in the sport of
Could Jermell Charlo go up to another weight class, be outweighed by 20 pounds, and completely outskill that fighter? And Anthony Joshua, I do understand that he has certain limitations, but let's also give Anthony Joshua some credit here. He also has one of the better resumes for his division out of any other boxers in boxing. So that win that Alexander Usyk had was a great, great win.
boxing
And that's not even talking about a lot of the undefeated fighters like Glowacki or overall like that of Amaris Bradis or like that overall of a Michael Hunter that he beat at the cruiserweight division. But anyway.
social media has emerged. I mean, ESPN has gotten so comfortable with the disrespect towards Black American boxers. They're committing these crimes in broad daylight. They see the camera right in front of them, they don't even care. They're not even wearing masks when they rob the bank. They're telling you their name. They're telling the police.
And here goes Dante's Boxing Nation once again on a bitch, woman-like emotional rant. It is what it is. Listen, I understand this point to a degree, but this is why you cannot rely on a channel like this or Boxing Eagle, because they just get way too over-emotional. And they think overall in their heads that they're Lodge going objective, but they really don't even know the first thing about being Lodge going objective. And I say the same thing for ESPN and Fox Sports News. I don't trust them as far as I can see them either. But it is what it is.
And the bank teller.
Because if you're really logical and objective, there's no way that Jermell Charlo, there's really no way that he makes your top 5 pound for pound. If he makes you top 10, that's understandable. But top 5, no, come on.
This is my address. I'm robbing your bank. And if you ever want to come see
Even if you were to overall put Canelo Alvarez and Tyson Fury off the list, let's just say that you could still debate that Jermell Charlo is not within the top 5 pound for pound. Because personally, I would put Dimitri Bivol, Shakur Stevenson, and Devin Haney all over Jermell Charlo, personally. But anyway.
Here's my address. Here's my driver's license. Knock yourself out. They don't care if you know what they're doing. And the reason why they don't care, the reason why they're so comfortable to do it, because they are very confident that all of these Black American boxers that they disrespect will never come out, get on the microphone, and completely expose them. I mean, Jermell Charlo, he exposed the racist reporter Mike Coppinger, who works for ESPN. But power and change is in numbers. It has to be many Black American boxers and even non-Black American promoters, managers, any person of influence. Even Steven Espinoza, he can be talking about this. All it takes is a couple of anti-racist people to do some interviews and expose how biased ESPN is when it comes to how they are treating Black American boxers. You see, ESPN...
Well, you can argue all in all that they're somewhat biased with their attitudes towards Black fighters. I would not necessarily 100% disagree with that. But listen, at the end of the day, at least in my view, there's just not going to be a lot overall that can be changed about it. Boxing has always been a pro-racial sport. The fight game has always been a pro-racial sport. At the end of the day, I don't think that much is going to change about that. And just as ESPN overall is not going to change, someone like a Dante's Boxing Nation is not going to change either. They pretty much overall are set in their ways. And the only way to really counter them is to really come up with their own type of media like what Dante has done overall, which I think is somewhat to a degree a good thing. But unfortunately, I just think that Dante sometimes misses the mark. But it is what it is, because unfortunately for him, I just think that he's a little bit too over-emotional. But anyway.
And they feel as long as they have Terrence Crawford at number 1, that will create some type of diversion, some type of distraction, so fans won't pay attention to who else they have on that list and who they don't have. And like I said, they have Terrence Crawford as number 1 on their list right now. But keep in mind, this was after...
Well, Dante, let's also be real about this list. I mean, don't get me wrong. There's certain things that I disagree with this list. I would not have Vasily Lomachenko at the current moment in time on my top 10 pound per pound list. And I also would not have Naoya Inoue anywhere near that high. But if we really take a look at this list, this is not the worst list that I've seen. I mean, really, technically, other lists like that of the champ side list, who have fighters like that of who the hell is that one dude at the welterweight division who's very talented but hasn't even won a belt yet? Jerome Boots Ennis. I mean, you guys overall have fighters like you once upon a time had Deontay Wilder and Jerome Boots Ennis on the list. So once again, come on. I mean, it is what it is. And they do have that of Shakur Stevenson, Devin Haney, and Terrence Crawford and Errol Spence on there. So it's not like overall they just don't have any black fighters. You just don't like where they're ranked. And don't get me wrong, that's not me saying that ESPN is not biased with the commentary or with the list sometimes. Sometimes they can be. But let's be real, Dante, you're just as biased, sometimes if not even worse. Because Dante, basically what his objective is what 10 black fighters can I put on this top 10 pound for pound list? That's pretty much all Dante wants to do. Whether it's a logical decision or not. But anyways, that's pretty much about it for this video. I don't want to stretch this out too long. I think I made the video long enough. I think I made my point. But it's going to be very interesting to see where Mr. Jermell Charlo goes from here. It's also going to be very interesting to see where some of the other great boxers that I've seen in this generation go from here. But Jermell Charlo, in my view, his true test is going to be that'll be the Terrence Bud Crawford or Errol Spence Jr. because there really isn't any A-grade tests, in my view, for him at 154. And in my view, if he faces either that of a Terrence Crawford or that of a Errol Spence Jr., I don't think that he's going to beat either of them. But I could be wrong. But anyways, we'll see what happens. That's pretty much about it for today. I just thought that I would talk about that because I found it very particularly interesting. But anyways, that's really about it for today. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.